When we talk about love bombing, people usually imagine excessive compliments, grand gestures, constant attention. But there's a quieter, more confusing version that doesn't look flashy at all, and that's love bombing through trauma dumping. This is where someone shares deeply personal, painful experiences very early on and frames it as vulnerability or honesty. And on the surface, it can feel meaningful. It can feel intimate. It can even feel like trust. But timing matters. And when trauma is unloaded immediately, before a relationship has any foundation, that's not intimacy, it's intensity. What happens in these moments is subtle. Someone might tell you about childhood abuse, past betrayals, devastating losses, or long-standing emotional wounds within the first few conversations. There hasn't been time to build safety, consistency, or reciprocity. Yet suddenly you're holding extremely heavy emotional material. And many empathic, emotionally aware people respond by leaning in. You listen closely. You feel compassion. You feel honored that they chose you to share this with. That sense of being special is not accidental. It's part of the hook. The nervous system doesn't always know the difference between closeness and overload. Emotional intensity can trick the brain into believing a deep bond exists even when trust hasn't been earned. You may feel like you've skipped ahead in the relationship, like something profound is happening faster than usual. But healthy connection grows gradually. It's layered. It's mutual. Trauma dumping skips all of that and jumps straight into emotional urgency, creating a false sense of closeness that hasn't had time to stabilize. Another important piece here is consent. Healthy vulnerability involves checking in, pacing, and respecting whether the other person has the capacity to hold what's being shared. Trauma dumping doesn't ask, it floods. And when you're flooded early, you don't get to decide if you're ready. You're already in it. That can leave you feeling responsible, protective, and emotionally invested before you've even had the chance to evaluate whether this relationship is safe or balanced for you. Over time, this early oversharing sets a tone. The relationship becomes anchored in pain rather than mutual curiosity, shared values, or emotional reciprocity. You may notice that your role is less about being known and more about listening, soothing, understanding. And because the bond formed through intensity, not trust, pulling back can feel wrong, even though nothing about the pacing was healthy to begin with. This is why it's so important to remember, real intimacy unfolds over time. It doesn't demand emotional labor upfront. It doesn't overwhelm you to prove closeness, and it never confuses emotional exposure with emotional safety. If connection starts with pressure instead of pace, that's not vulnerability, it's a warning sign. Once trauma dumping creates that initial sense of closeness, something else quietly locks into place: accelerated trust. This is where emotional intensity gets mistaken for emotional safety. When someone shares painful, deeply personal experiences early on, the bond can feel unusually strong, unusually fast. You may think, I've never connected with anyone like this before. And that belief makes sense because your nervous system is responding to depth, not durability. Human beings are wired to respond to stories, especially stories of suffering. When someone opens up about trauma, your empathy activates. You want to comfort, understand, reassure. That emotional engagement releases bonding chemicals in the brain, and suddenly the connection feels significant. But here's the catch: significance is not the same as trust. Trust is built through consistency, accountability, and time. Trauma dumping shortcuts all of that and creates a bond based on shared emotional intensity rather than earned reliability. This fast-tracked connection often feels almost magical. Conversations become long and deep very quickly. You may feel like you get each other on a soul level. There's often language about fate, destiny, or finally being understood. But when trust forms this quickly, there's usually very little real information about how this person handles conflict, boundaries, disappointment, or responsibility. You feel close before you actually know them. And that's where the imbalance begins. Because when trust is accelerated artificially, it tends to benefit the person who initiated the intensity. They receive empathy, validation, and emotional closeness without having to demonstrate stability or reciprocity. Meanwhile, you may start adjusting your behavior to protect the bond, being more available, more understanding, more forgiving because it feels like something precious is already at stake. This kind of bonding can also override your internal warning signals. Normally, time gives us space to notice red flags. But when emotional closeness is rushed, questioning the relationship can feel like betrayal. You may think, how could someone who shared so much pain be unsafe? Yet pain disclosure is not the same as emotional health. Someone can be deeply wounded and still be deeply dysregulating to be close to. What's especially powerful here is how quickly this bond can feel exclusive. You might feel like you're the only one who truly understands them, the only one they can talk to. That sense of being uniquely chosen strengthens attachment, but it also narrows your perspective. The relationship becomes emotionally consuming before it becomes emotionally secure. Healthy trust unfolds slowly. It grows through actions matching words, through repair after rupture, through respect for pacing. When connection feels urgent instead of steady, intense instead of grounded, that's not depth, it's a shortcut. And shortcuts in relationships almost always come with a cost. After trust has been rushed and emotional intensity has taken the lead, there's often a quiet shift that many people don't notice until they're already exhausted. The dynamic changes, and suddenly you're no longer just a partner, a friend, or someone getting to know another human being. You become the regulator, the container, the steady one, the person whose job it is to hold everything together emotionally. It doesn't usually happen in an obvious way. There's no formal agreement. It unfolds subtly through repeated patterns. They come to you when they're dysregulated, overwhelmed, anxious, angry, or falling apart. You become the place where emotions are deposited and processed. And because you're empathetic, emotionally attuned, and capable, you step in, you soothe, you listen, you reassure. Over time, this stops being an occasional moment of support and starts becoming your role. What's important to notice is the imbalance. Their emotions take up space. Your emotions get minimized, delayed, or sidelined. When you try to share something difficult, the conversation somehow circles back to them. Or your feelings feel inconvenient because they're already going through so much. The relationship becomes organized around managing their inner world rather than build something mutual. This is where the rescuer dynamic quietly locks in. You may feel needed in a way that feels meaningful at first, being the person who understands, who stabilizes, who shows up. There's a sense of purpose in that. But over time, being needed replaces being known. And that's a problem because healthy relationships involve two people who can regulate themselves and make space for each other. They are not built on one person doing the emotional heavy lifting. There's also an unspoken pressure that develops. If you pull back, set a boundary, or express fatigue, it can feel like you're abandoning someone who is already wounded. Guilt becomes part of the glue holding the connection together. You may start to suppress your own needs to avoid triggering their distress. And that's how emotional labor turns into emotional sacrifice. The role reversal is especially dangerous because it often starts early. When trauma dumping happens at the beginning, the caretaker role gets established before equality ever has a chance to form. And once that role is in place, it's hard to undo. The relationship doesn't ask, "How are we together?" It asks, "Can you handle me?" If you find yourself constantly regulating someone else's emotions while your own go unattended, that's not intimacy. That's unpaid emotional labor dressed up as connection. And any bond that depends on you disappearing emotionally so someone else can stay afloat is not a bond worth preserving. Once you've been pulled into the role of emotional regulator, something even heavier tends to settle into the relationship guilt. And this is where love bombing through trauma dumping becomes especially sticky, because now it's no longer just about connection, it's about obligation. After someone has shared their deepest wounds with you, leaving, distancing, or even questioning the relationship can start to feel morally wrong. You're not just stepping away from a dynamic. You're stepping away from someone's pain. This guilt doesn't usually arrive as a direct accusation at first. It shows up in sighs, in subtle reminders of how hard their life has been, in comments about how everyone leaves or how you're the only one who understands. Even when it's not said outright, the message is clear. If you go, you're just like everyone else at. And because you're a conscientious, empathetic person, that lands hard. What's happening here is emotional leverage. The trauma they shared early on becomes a kind of unspoken contract. You know their story. You know their wounds. And now you're expected to behave accordingly, to be patient, to be forgiving, to overlook behaviors that would otherwise concern you. The bar for what you tolerate quietly moves, not because you're comfortable with it, but because you feel responsible. This is where people start negotiating theft themselves. You might think, they've been through so much, maybe I'm asking for too much. Or this is just how they are because of their trauma. And slowly, your own needs begin to feel selfish in comparison. You may stop bringing things up. You may stop setting boundaries, not because you don't have them, but because you're afraid of what asserting them might do to the other person. The really painful part is that this guilt often masquerades as compassion. You tell yourself you're being kind, understanding, supportive. But compassion should never require self-erasure. When a relationship is held together primarily by fear of hurting the other person, that's not love, it's emotional captivity. Choice disappears, and duty takes its place. Over time, this dynamic can trap you. Even when you feel drained, unseen, or emotionally unsafe, leaving feels cruel. You're no longer asking, is this healthy for me? You're asking, can they handle it if I go? And that question alone tells you everything you need to know about how unbalanced the relationship has become. Healthy relationships allow for freedom. They don't rely on guilt to maintain closeness. They don't weaponize vulnerability to keep someone from leaving. If the only thing holding a connection together is your fear of causing pain, then the pain is already happening, it's just happening to you by this point in the dynamic. The language of the relationship often sounds very healthy on the surface. Words like vulnerability, honesty, and emotional openness get used a lot. And that can make it incredibly hard to name what's actually happening. Because who wants to criticize vulnerability? But this is where we have to slow things down and talk about boundaries, because real vulnerability and boundary violation are not the same thing, even though they can look similar at first glance. Healthy vulnerability is paced. It unfolds with mutual consent and emotional readiness on both sides. It respects the other person's capacity, timing, and comfort. Trauma dumping, on the other hand, ignores those signals. It's not a shared opening, it's an emotional flood. You're given more than you asked for, more than you're ready to hold, and often more than the relationship has earned. And when that happens repeatedly, it stops feeling connecting and starts feeling overwhelming. One of the most telling signs here is how your discomfort is handled. In healthy dynamics, if you say, "This is a lot for me," that statement is respected. In unhealthy ones, your hesitation is interpreted as rejection. You may be told you're closed off, afraid of intimacy, or bad at emotional connection. Suddenly, having boundaries is framed as a flaw rather than a form of self-respect. This is where the confusion really deepens, because you're being asked to override your instincts in the name of closeness. You start doubting yourself. Am I being too sensitive? Am I emotionally unavailable? But discomfort is not dysfunction. Feeling overwhelmed is often your nervous system signaling that something is moving too fast or too far. When boundaries are consistently crossed under the banner of vulnerability, you're trained to tolerate emotional overload. You learn that connection requires endurance. That love means absorbing someone else's pain without limits. And over time, that erodes your sense of autonomy. You stop checking in with yourself and start prioritizing how the other person feels above all else. True emotional intimacy never requires self-betrayal. It doesn't punish you for having limits. It doesn't confuse emotional flooding with depth. And it certainly doesn't demand that you sacrifice your own emotional safety to prove that you care. If being open means you're no longer allowed to protect yourself, then that's not vulnerability. It's a boundary violation dressed up as closeness. Eventually, the intensity that once felt meaningful starts to feel heavy. What began as deep connection turns into emotional exhaustion, and this is where the final shift happens, the move from idealization to depletion. Early on, you were praised for your empathy, your patience, your ability to handle them. You were seen as special, different, the one who finally understands. But relationships built on trauma-based love bombing can't sustain that level of emotional output forever. At some point, you get tired. You may start needing more space, more balance, more reciprocity. And that's when tone changes. The appreciation fades. The warmth cools. You may notice irritation where gratitude once lived, or distance where closeness used to be. Not because you did something wrong, but because you're no longer providing unlimited emotional supply. This shift can be deeply destabilizing. You might find yourself working harder to get back to how it was in the beginning, chasing that early intensity, wondering what changed. But what changed is simple. You stopped overfunctioning. You stopped absorbing everything without question. And in a dynamic that relied on emotional extraction, that feels like betrayal, often this is when devaluation begins. You may be criticized for being cold, selfish, or not as supportive anymore. The very qualities that were once idealized, your empathy, your steadiness, are now used against you. And because the relationship started with such emotional closeness, this rejection can cut deeply. You're left grieving not just the relationship, but the version of it you believed was real. What's important to understand is that the bond was never truly mutual, it was conditional. As long as you were regulating, rescuing, and absorbing, you were valued. When you needed care yourself, the system broke down. That's not a failure on your part. That's the inevitable outcome of imbalanced dynamic. By the time this stage arrives, many people feel depleted, confused, and emotionally hollow. They've given so much without receiving stability in return. And yet, they may still blame themselves, believing they didn't try hard enough. But healthy relationships don't drain you. They don't punish you for having limits. And they don't collapse when you stop performing emotional labor. If a connection only works when you are exhausted, silent, and self-sacrificing, then it was never love, it was consumption.